We're good. And then later that day or the following day, her and somebody else is planning on, they're all being jealous and bossy about, well, who does Moses think he is? Why is he in charge? I should be in charge.
Oh.
And they tested God in their heart by asking for the food of their fancy. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Now, here is one thing that I have noticed to be true. Whenever, and I think this will back this up biblically, but I have noticed, whenever we are blessed, whenever we have what they call a mountaintop experience, whenever that happens, there is usually hell to be paid on the other side of that. As an example, just here a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Satan, that was revealing the king of lies, king of cheats. We were exposing him for who he is and what he is. And there were consequences to be paid. And we were still paying a couple of weeks later. That always happens. Now Shannon is the one who brought that message, and Shannon right now is in a world of hurt in many, many ways. And that is not atypical, that is very typical. And it's not just because of Satan. It's because here, okay, let's make this up close and personal. If I want to be the one that's important in your life, and something really good happens, I know that if you spend a lot of time thinking about that, I'm going to lose control. So the second that's done, I'm going to go back to making you feel badly, because I want you to remember who's in charge of you, how you feel. I'm in charge of how you feel, not God. That's how Satan operates. It's kind of like when he was talking to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Did God really say? So she's got it made in the shade, okay? And so now he's going to come at her. He, in his mind, he's thinking, I'm going to be in control here, not God. I deserve to be in control. I deserve to get the praise. So how does he do that? Well, she's got everything in the world. So what he's going to do is put doubt in her mind. It's the same with us today. It's the same old stupid trick. And it happens almost every single time. But, as I said earlier, if you're doing the things that you should be doing, you should be going from miracle to miracle. Does that mean there's not going to be bad things? No. Here's another thing that I've noticed. You do research on pastors that are effective pastors, and you look into their lives. I guarantee you there is tragedy. Big tragedy. Like babies stillborn, or children killed in car wrecks, or houses that burn down, or wives that are taken. Big stuff. Because Satan does not want God to get the glory for what is happening in that pastor's life. He wants to get his eyes off of that so that the pastor's concentrating on his mess.
Right.
Okay? And I've noticed that to be true.
Yes.
So if you ever find a pastor that has had a golden life and nothing bad has ever happened and it seems like he's got the world by the horns, you be very, very careful. Verse 20, behold, he struck the rock so that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide meat for his people? Okay, He just saved 1 million people from Pharaoh. He just got done doing 10 miracles to get them out of there. He just destroyed an entire army by dividing the sea a day ago. He just provided water for 1 million people, and she's saying, can he provide meat for us? Really? Therefore the Lord heard this and was furious. Well, excuse me, but I would be too. You know, I go to the grocery store, I bring you home filet mignon, bring you steak, I bring you veggies, I bring you dessert, and you're complaining because I didn't bring the chef to cook it for you? So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger came up against Israel, because they did not believe in God. And God did not trust in his salvation. Yet he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven, had rained down manna on them to eat, and give them the bread of heaven. So God was angry.
But he still blessed them.
But he still provided.
Yeah.
And not only did he provide, look what he called it.
Angels.
He gave them the food of angels. The bread of heaven. Men ate angels' food. He sent them food to the full. Again, think of the abortion. He caused an east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He also rained meat on them like the dust. Okay, do you remember when he did that? He had doves fly over, and each one had as many doves to eat as they wanted, because they were complaining about not having meat. Feathered fowl like the sand on the seas, and he let them fall in the midst of their camp. So not only did it bring them birds, but they died right in the middle of their camp. They didn't even have to go hunt for it. All around their dwellings. So it's raining birds. So they ate and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not deprived of their craving. But while their food was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came against them and slew the stoutest of them and struck down the choice men of Israel. Now, let's go back to the abortion thing. I think we've all known women that have had abortions, and I can tell you they all have a couple of things in common. They continually pay a price for that decision. From the second they have that abortion, for the rest of their life, they pay a price. Now, God gave them the desire of their heart, the meat. But while the food was still in their mouth, he killed them. He killed the choicest men. Why do you think he killed the choicest men instead of the scragglers or the women or the children?
They were the more greedy, more full of love.
Nope. Nope. Because God says, I am a mighty God. I'm going to take the strongest and biggest and baddest of you, and I'm going to take you. I want you to know that I'm God. I provided you what you wanted. I brought you into the desert. Now I'm going to take you out of the desert. In spite of this, they still sinned. Again, think of the abortion. They still sinned against him. He provided the food. He provided the water. He provided transportation, protection, warmth. Here's another thing. They were in the desert for 40 years. Do you think they had stores in the desert? Have you ever tried to wear the same clothes day in and day out? How long do you think they last before they start getting ratty and old? A couple of months? They were there 40 years. Shoes didn't wear out. They were in the desert. Their shirt and pants got soaking wet from the heat. and it didn't rot. The clothes didn't rot, they didn't get holy, they didn't get nasty.
That was a blessing too.
In spite of this, they still sinned and did not believe in his wondrous works. Therefore, their days he consumed in futility. Now, what does that mean? That means he let them spend the next 40 years walking around the desert in a great big circle. That's futility. And their years in fear. When he slew them, then they sought him. Are we like that today?
Yes.
And they returned and sought earnestly for God. Remember the week I explained the Old Testament and us is a great big wheel? Remember that? The God and the Jews were one. Then the Jews sinned. Then they cried out for help. God came in and saved them, and they started over, and it goes over and over and over. And here it says, and they returned and sought earnestly for God. Then they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God their Redeemer.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, they flattered him with their mouth. And they lied to him with their tongue. Do you think God knows the condition of your heart when you pray or say something?
Yes, yes, truly.
Okay. So the Jews thought, okay, so we're going to tell him that he's all that in sliced bread too, but in our hearts we know that's not true. Because, you know, God can't see our hearts, he's just going to hear our words.
But God knows our heart.
He does. For their heart was not steadfast with him, nor were they faithful in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and did not destroy them. Okay, again, think of the abortion. Now look at what he said. God said that their sin was lying to him in their heart and with their mouth. And remember, what did Jesus say that it took to be saved in the New Testament? You have to believe with your heart and confess with your mouth, right? And so what, here in the Old Testament, what is God saying that they did? They lied and they deceived in their heart and they lied with their tongue.
Did the opposite.
Okay? But he forgave their iniquity, his sin, their sin. But in God's mind and in God's heart, not believing in your heart and lying with your tongue, they should have been destroyed. How much more for abortion? If lying to God with your tongue in God's mind deserves you to be destroyed, what do you think in God's mind the punishment should be for abortion, killing a baby? Let's call it what it is. Let's not give it fancy names. Killing a baby. I'm not going to answer that. I just want you to think. I want you to draw the comparison all the way through this. Because, and here's why, in case I didn't tell you. When we read this, we have a tendency, all of us today in America, I would think, when we read this, we think, boy, how stupid can you be? He's given you food and water and clothes and protected you and all of that, and you're lying to him? Boy, you're dumb. But when you bring that up to today's issues and today's problems and the way that we behave, we're just as stupid. He gives you life. He gives you a chance to get saved. He gave you his son. He gives you a place to live and to work and money and he gives you everything. And you're killing his babies. And yet he forgives you. Yes, many a time he turned his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath, for he remembered that they were but flesh. Thank God.
Yeah.
A breath that passes away and does not come again. How does Paul call that in the New Testament? We're just a mist here for a short time.
Yeah.
How often they provoked him in the wilderness. Let's reword that. How often they killed his babies in the United States. Let's put a number on that. 334 plus thousand last year. And grieved him in the desert. Yes, again and again they tempted God. Now what does that mean, they tempted God? God can't be tempted, can he? And if so, how did the Jews tempt him?
By their ways. Their
Murmuring,
evil ways.
complaining, their hearts.
What were they
doubts.
tempting him to do?
Let them go back to Egypt.
They were tempting God. It's kind of like two kids on a playground. And the bully says, if you do that again, I'm going to beat the crud out of you.
Daring.
And then they go, nah, 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 I did it anyway. So they're provoking God. They're tempting God to just beat the snot out of them. And limited the Holy One of Israel. What does that mean?
Limiting God's power.
It is, but how? But how? He says, yes, again and again they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. How were they limiting him? Remember, they're on a journey to the land of milk and honey. God has the power at any minute to give them,
Take him out.
well, to give them the land of milk and honey.
Yeah.
Let me paint you a picture. Here is the land of milk and honey. Here's the desert. For 40 years, God does this with the Jews. Here's the land of milk and honey.
Can't make it.
And they're tempting him to not only to not let them go in, but to kill them. Nah, 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 nah.
But do you think they understood that?
I do. So they were limiting God. Okay, so that would be kind of like, again, with the abortion, somebody using abortion as birth control. Okay? And then getting down on their knees and praying for a blessing. It's just like in the book of Habakkuk. When God says, are you kidding me right now? You're asking me for a blessing? You robbed from me. And they say, well, how did we rob from you? And God said, I told you to give me 10%, and what you do give me is garbage. I wanted the first 10%, you're giving me garbage, and then most of the time you're not giving me 10%. And you come to me and ask me for a blessing. No. So now we as Americans go to God and ask for a blessing. Protect our country. And God says, are you kidding me right now? You killed 337 of my babies. Now, I'm not going to make you go into captivity yet, but guess what? Islam's coming for you. And you're going to lose 2,000 American lives in those two buildings. And billions of dollars. Let's see how you react then. And guess what? We're still killing God's babies. Then God says, okay, now I'm going to give you domestic terrorism, and we're going to do school shootings, and then I'm going to let you kill your own kids after you get to know them, just like I knew my kids. It's still they sin. They did not remember his power, the day when he redeemed them from the enemy. When he worked his signs in Egypt, remember the signs I told you, the 10 miracles? The frogs and the taking the firstborn, all that. Okay. And his wonders in the field of Zoan turned their rivers into blood, and their streams they could not drink. He sent swarms of flies among them, so he's going down some of them, which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. He also gave their crops to the caterpillar, and their labor to the locust. If you go back and read that, by the way, in the book of Exodus, I want you to think about something. It rained frogs. Have you ever seen a frog hit the ground? They don't bounce.
No.
It turns into frog nog.
Frog nog.
So my question is, not only was it a miracle that it rained frogs, but they landed and then did whatever God told them to do. And their labor, which was in the fields, God gave to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail and their sycamore trees with frost. He also gave up their cattle to the hail and their flocks to fiery lightning. Now I want you to think about this. He just went down where he destroyed just about everything. A lot of this is repeated again in the book of the Revelation, by the way. He did this to the non-believing Egyptians. Okay, first off. They haven't killed anybody. The Egyptians have not killed anybody. He's just not letting what he considers to be slaves out of his country
Worship the Lord.
to worship a God that he doesn't believe in.
Right.
And God is destroying his country piece by piece by piece. And yet the abortions continue. He hasn't killed anybody. The Jews, by lying to God, hasn't killed anybody. And in God's mind, they should have been destroyed. He cast on them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, indignation, and trouble by sending angels of destruction among them. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare their souls from death, but gave their life over to the plague and destroyed all the firstborn in Egypt. All of that happened because he wouldn't let his people go. Now, here's a spiritual truth I want you to remember. God does not play around when somebody messes with his kids. It was true then,
All right.
and it's true now. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If you belong to God, now in the case of Egypt, it was non-believers. He's merciless with them. I've seen it happen because I was the focus. And I prayed that. And oh my God, I learned a very valuable lesson. You do not pray that prayer unless you are prepared to have that person's life totally destroyed, because he will totally destroy it. God does not want his people messed with. But you have to turn it completely over to God. Okay? That is a spiritual truth. It's true then. The non-believers were messing with the Jews.
They're not believers.
And the longer they messed with the Jews, the more intense the sin or the destruction of them. And the last thing God did, okay, and I want you to look at it this way. It started out with just, flies. And so Satan's angels made some flies. And so kind of like tit for tat, And then finally God says, okay, all right, you want to go? Let's go. Let's
You wanna
rumble.
fight?
All right,
You don't want to fight me.
so now he starts destroying the country piece by piece. I'm going to take all of your fields. Then I'm going to take all of your drinking water. Then I'm going to take all your cattle. And what's the ultimate last thing? I'm going to take every firstborn in your entire country.
male and animals.
And he took them all in one night.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah.
I don't know how many people there were, but there were over 1 million Jews that left there. I believe, if I remember right, it was estimated at around 3 million left. And they were the slaves. So there had to be at least 3 million Egyptians. And since the Jews were just in one area of Egypt called Goshen, which was only a part, I'm going to guess there was probably 15 to 20 million Egyptians. And if he took the firstborn, that means he took a quarter of the population in one night. So let's say that there was 20 million. 25% of 20 million is 4.5 million in one night. And that's not counting the animals. One night. All because he wouldn't let the Jews go.
I love watching that movie I think it's on every year, isn't it? Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
I like it so much.
The first of their strength in the tents of Ham, but he made his own people go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And I told you last week, sheep are the dumbest animals God ever created.
And we're just like them.
And the
Our
hummus.
armadillos are smarter than sheep, and their heads are about this big.
Yeah.
And he led them on safely so that they did not fear. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies. Okay, so we just went through everything that God did to the Egyptians while they were still in Egypt. Now he's going to go through and tell them how he brought them out. And he brought them to his holy border. This mountain, which was right hand had acquired. And we talked last week, the right hand meant power. He also drove out the nations before them, allotted them an inheritance. Now we're talking about entering the land of milk and honey. Okay? So when this happened, he sent in all the mighty men of Egypt, and they drove out all the enemies, killed them all, and their animals. By the way, why did God do that? So he goes into a country, and there's a whole society living there. And God says, I don't want you to take any captives. I want you to go in, I want you to kill everybody, man, woman, and child, and animal. Kill them all. Why did he do that? Pretty barbaric. But there's a reason. The same reason he told the Jewish men not to marry foreign women. Remember, the reason he had them, one of the reasons he had them roaming around the desert was they had not quite filled up the beaker filled with sin yet. God was still going to give these guys a chance. When it finally reached the top and God had had his fill, he said, okay, there's no redeeming them. If I let them take them as slaves, some of their nastiness is going to wear off onto my people. You can't have that. I have to be their God. They got to go. So he sent in the mighty men and he said, kill them all. Why did he take the animals? Most of the time, not all the time.
So they couldn't eat.
Nope.
No?
So they would rely on God.
Oh, okay.
Allotted them an inheritance by survey, and made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. So he not only gave them the land of milk and honey, he got rid of all the enemies, and he divided the country up and gave them their own inheritance.
I think it's been 30 minutes again.
Okay, let's, I'll tell you what, let's call that a night. Let me use your pen. We'll call that a night. Thank you. I marked it in mine, but somebody else marked it. We left off. We'll start verse 56 next week. Any questions? All right, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, you are an awesome, awesome God. I want to give you thanks and praise and glory for everything.